Okay, welcome to the next podcast at Evolving Man. Um, Today I've got Alex Renton, uh, who is here, and today we're going to be talking about boarding school, among other things. Alex is a writer, a journalist whose career has ranged from arts and foods writing to politics and the investigation of child abuse. His career was as a war reporter and development worker, and it took him to the Middle East, Africa, East Asia, and the Balkans. He's worked for The Independent, The Times, Newsweek, and the London Evening Standard, and contributed to a host of other newspapers and magazines. He is also the author of the ebook Planet Carnivore: How Cheap Meat Costs the Earth. Alex has won many awards for his work in investigative journalism, conflict and development reporting, and for food writing, including the One World Award and the Glenfiddich Trophy. Born in Canada, educated in English boarding schools and at Exeter University, Alex now lives in Edinburgh with his wife, son, and daughter. Welcome, Alex. Really happy to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you very much for having me, Piers.
So the reason I reached out is I was reading your book over the last year or so, and as you see, I like to make
post-it notes.
I like to make notes, and we share a similar theme that I went to boarding school myself, and I really loved the amount of detail and research that went into your book. And I reached out just because I'd really love to hear some of your opinions about boarding school. And kind of beginning, I'd really love you to share your own experience at school.
Yes, we have to include a bit of after school as well, because in a way that's where the experience crystallizes, I suppose. Yes, so I I come from a very privileged background, and on my mother's side, 11 generations of boarders back into the 18th century. And my father, kind of similar. My father went to Eton, so it was sort of predestined that I, from that class, would go. And so when I was 8, I was sent to a school called Ashdown House, which again, very well known, tiny but elite prep school known for feeding children into Eton. I started the same day as Princess Margaret's son, David Linley. And the school, Boris Johnson was a pupil 3 years later. So I did 5 years there, and then 5 years at Eton. Sorry, not 5 years at Eton, because I was expelled from Eton at 16 for a sort of drink, drugs, sex scandal. Though I suppose looking back, I pretty much engineered it. I was quite happy that it happened. I'd become a fully fledged rebel by that stage, which again is not unusual. So up to that point, up to 16 years old, I was a pretty standard product of a system that was then churning out tens of thousands, around 100,000 people a year, I think, in the 70s, and emerged, with what some would see the advantages. I remain an extremely well-connected person. In many ways, my parents got what they paid for, but I think, I now realize, look, I was carrying the effects of complex childhood trauma, starting with abandonment and sexual and physical and psychological abuse, and years of neglect and not being heard or listened to. And those, became quite explosive elements in my character as my life went forward. And some you'd have to say are positive in a way. Certainly my career as an investigative journalist, hope as a challenger of authority, comes from beliefs I grew when I was an early teen about the hypocrisy of adults and institutions. but I needed help in a therapeutic psychiatric way pretty badly, really, from my mid-teens, and it took a very long time to get to grips with that. And I think I did quite a lot of damage to myself and other people in the intervening years. I mean, just talking, I mean, my wife, as I told you, is a child and adolescent psychotherapist and deals particularly with childhood trauma, and working in the state system and privately. And she showed us some issues that, if she reads a lot and I read a lot of what she recommends to me. I mean, and I can see pretty clearly also from reading people like George Shavarian and Nick Duffel, that I'm a pretty average kind of boarding school survivor. In how what transpired in what what I in my symptoms, if you like, and then in, if you like, also in my how I worked to heal myself. I'm not usual at all in that I'm in my privilege, because of being a journalist and a member, if you like, of that elite class. I was able to access the levers to get some payback in the most simple way. Now, I'm not sure that's a good thing, but I had some power which many of the survivors I know, and I've spoken and written to hundreds and hundreds of them, did not.
Yeah.
So in some ways, I'm a very lucky boarding school survivor.
Thank you for sharing. Interesting. The question I have kind of stemming from that is 2013, you write in your book, in the introduction, you read this article, you saw the front page of, I think it was the Daily Mail, was it?
Yes.
And how did that change after seeing that?
Well, I mean, the article, for those who don't know the story, it was pretty brutal. It was front page headlines saying something along the lines of Linley school survivors to sue for I can't really should quote it from the book. I mean, survivors were suing for years of abuse at top school, something like, good old Daily Mail headline. And it was a real shocker, because I read it, I knew exactly who these survivors were, and I knew what they were talking about. And I had no idea. I mean, most of them a couple of years younger than me, so I had no idea that they'd started this campaign. And it was a punch to the gut, and also, very exciting as well. I think people will recognize that emotion when there seems to be a breakthrough in something that's been stuck for so long. So my first act was to call my mum, as you do, and ask her. She's not a Daily Mail reader, my mum, but told her about it. And the first thing she said to me was, "Oh my goodness, darling, I always wondered what actually happened there." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? How would you wonder that?" And she said, "Because of when you told me that a teacher was touching you in a way that you don't like." And so we unfolded this story, which I had completely blanked or forgotten, because I knew what she was talking about, but I'd never talked about it with her as far as I knew. And I realized that at the age of 9, possibly 10, I had, which is quite unusually, I had told my mother, I had disclosed, and about the sexual abuse of a particularly violent, nasty man, maths teacher. And so, of course, I was then faced with the fact that my mother knew and hadn't acted, which was devastating, really, in this kind of slow way. Because my mother was still one of the good guys in my family psychodrama at that point. And, with children pretty much just the same age as myself, I was absolutely gobsmacked that she could have let it go. I mean, she did go and try and confront the school, but they talked her down. So that was the fuel to start looking at it. So with my but my wife's backing, we went back to the school and posing as prospective parents, and I started to talk to people and unwind it all. And then, again, this is my privilege. I was able to, access a good editor on a good magazine who himself was a boarding school survivor, and say, look, I want to write about this. And, and laid out my story, which, got a lot of attention because it was Boris Johnson and David and a royal nephew's son at son's school, plus various Hollywood actors too. But so that's kind of a process for me, which was very easy for me because I just sort of clicked into my journalistic self. So within hours of the publication of that article in the Observer in 2014, I was getting a deluge with emails, and they were from people. I mean, I suppose the most. None of them were average, but the most normal one was, I'd no idea we were allowed to talk about this. This is what happened to me at mine. I've never spoken about it. I kind of wish I had. I think I can talk about it to you because you are of my sort. I'm not breaking the barrier, I'm not going outside the class in talking. And so within a couple of months, I had a massive story on my hands in the most crude way. But it was the volume of allegations, testimonials that was, it's daunting. It was terrifying, really. So from that came further investigations into some of the sort of headline schools. So you were only scratching the surface. I mean, we did Gordonston because it was interesting because of the rape of some young female pupils there. So child abuse of women in boarding school is very undertold, and eventually the newspaper kind of got bored. Someone actually said to me, I think that we've had enough posh abuse in the paper. So really the next step was the book, and sort of kind of campaigning, in whatever ways seemed best. I'd worked a bit as a campaigner in Oxfam and so on, to look at the bizarre fact that there were still 70,000 children at boarding in Britain, and that number wasn't going down, going up, if anything. Sorry, Piers, I'm answering at great length. You need to
no, please.
Chop me off.
No, this is the idea of a podcast for me, is just to have that space that people can just talk, because I think they're the interesting things come up.
Well, it's great to do it at leisure.
My wife really loves these long form podcasts, and she can listen to Joe Rogan, and she says, "Oh no, it's got to be really long."
No, which shows actually where traditional journalism has gone wrong, as in so many ways. But everyone gets chopped off. Out.
Yeah. So thank you. No, I really like that, and then other questions will come up as you speak. So. Thank you. I mean, one of the things my second question really I put down was, what are some of the insights you've had? Maybe you've shared a little bit there from publicly sharing your own journey,
Yes. I think, what physically what I now have is, I have a database which I continue to update because I still get 2 or 3 people in touch with me a month. And also because we made a film for ITV, which a lot of people see on YouTube, people who aren't so into reading perhaps, in which we investigated 4 schools, including mine. So what I, in a completely, I'm not in any way trained except as a journalist, but I do have a really great, it's the wrong word perhaps, but voluminous database of principally of allegations of behavior that would be seen as criminal now. And that I keep updated because it's useful because I can help people looking for more information about their own schools get in touch with each other while respecting confidentiality totally, because this is crucial importance. And of course, survivors of child abuse are legally protected in terms of anonymity anyway. And also it's helped investigations and quite a few prosecutions now, because many of the men who abused us are, and women who abused us, I should say, are still at large. But also in a much sort of less organized way, I have a pretty big picture of the kind of adverse childhood experiences in boarding school that how they can play out, and then also how people subsequently will act, and how they can then get happier. And I think the main thing I've always thought is that sexual abuse can be a bit of a I don't know how to put this in a sort of kind way, but a bit of a distraction. Because I think as you and certainly Joyce Shavarian and many other therapists in boarding school syndrome know is that psychological abuse, the experience of neglect and fear for an amount of time in children that young may have far further reaching effects, or sorry, I should say just as far-reaching effects as sexual and physical abuse. Of course, if you put the two together, which is often the case, they compound each other, and you're into a situation of multiple traumas. But from the beginning, it's been quite tragic, the number of people who have written to me going, "I don't know why I'm writing you, because nothing happened like the things I read in the papers. However, I was mocked every morning for 2 years for bedwetting in front of 200 children, or I begged mummy and daddy to take me away, and they said school doesn't work unless you hate it." Those sort of things. And I think from my own experience, where I was certainly I suffered criminal sexual abuse, but what I've been to the police about it. But what my principal abuser is dead. But what marked me was the psychological abuse from the headmaster. I think. But yes, that's the trauma I carry most. So that's really important, I think, in the beginning of it, and it's kind of why. We only 3 years ago first got legislation on the psychological abuse of the duty of adults not to psychologically abuse children. I mean, it's only just become a criminal offence. And I think anyone who works in child and adolescent therapy knows that. Yeah, I mean, I think you can see what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So that was absolutely crucial, and kind of hard in my work, because I knew as a journalist, I got stuff into papers or onto the telly with sexual abuse allegations. Yeah. So all you could do is drag the psychological side behind it. So I feel very bad about that. And it's a fight that we have to continue to have. Where we're addressing the happiness of children generally. I think the other thing, there's lots of other things that came out. An absolutely astonishing depth of material about the failure of parents, the collusion of parents in an abusive system, which is really shocking. And it tells you something quite important about our society, about our culture. A culture that demonizes poor people for bad parenting. Because some of the worst parenting I've ever heard about comes from some of the wealthiest, most highly educated people in the land. And then, of course, you get to the other end of the abusive, of the bad boarding school experience. And I'd made an estimation at one point that 30% of people, not my correspondents, but people, this is backed up by a few other people, called their boarding school experience bad or bad in parts. Is just how the traumas from that, and Nick Duffel has written really well about this, have affected our country, our society today. We Britons are the only people who do this to children that young. And then the final end of that is I have been privileged to watch a whole raft of people go through the post-boarding trauma journey, the PTSD journey, if you like. And I've seen people arrive at very good places and people whose lives and notably, this is again very important, the lives of those around them, those who love them, destroyed or destroyed. The collateral damage of that abuse, that neglect, is absolutely huge. Carry on for generations.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to just really thank you for all the courage, and I've heard this from some of the people commenting in my forum today on the boarding school forum, just the courage and the work that you've done over these years of standing up, and just because it takes a lot of grit and determination to do what you've done. So thank you. I really thank you for that.
Oh, thanks, Piers. It's really kind.
My own journey, I came across Nick Duffel's book. It came to me by synchronicity, as it does. A therapist said to me, "You have to read this book." And I was living in a Buddhist monastery at the time, and I got back to the monastery. There's a book in front of my door, and I turned to look at what it was, and it said The Making of Them. I'm like, oh my gosh.
No, amazing. Extraordinary.
And I just found, I put onto YouTube about 5 years ago, my own journey.
I haven't seen that.
And I was really worried about doing that because I thought of all the abuse that I'd get from people, especially from my own school. And over the years, I've just had people say, "Oh, thank you so much."
Yes. So interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think, you went to boarding school. The culture of omerta and not saying of not that. One of the principal things the headmaster of my prep school did was the biggest rule of all was don't tell your parents. That's imbued into us and the class. Goes on. I have been called a class traitor, not in jest. Yeah, more than once.
Interesting.
It's just but it's fascinating that people could really see. I just went public about the fact that I'd been mentally and physically abused as a child, and lots of other people had in the same context. That made me a class traitor, because So I had it, but as you say, the reaction almost entirely, completely positive, and I think the fact that what's been great for me, though I absolutely didn't plan it, and it was kind of a curse in the first year or so, was the fact of people feeling able to write to me. And because I think that may be the beginning of a therapeutic journey that they take with professionals, but and often I say to people, look, why don't you just write it all down like I did? See where that gets you. And so that ability has been an incredible boon to me. It's made me feel really great about the project, about having done it, because it clearly, you can just say to people, it's all right to talk. And it's amazing how many people hadn't worked that one out. And then help them too. Thank you.
I think talking, I see as men, I think we have this anyhow. And in some of my work, I've really got into the depth psychology of Jung's work with the archetypes. And I really see that, as boys, we're told anyhow, don't cry, stiff upper lip, anyhow. And then we go to boarding school, but it's that times 100, if you show any form of emotion, like you said, if you bedwet any weakness, then that becomes your nickname for life.
Yes.
So I guess one of the things I'd really love to go on to talk about is, you mentioned a little bit, what do you see some of the main issues that we as ex-boarders present?
I think, Nick Duffel's work, I came across it after I'd written the first article, and God, I wish I'd read it before. But in a way, perhaps it was good to come at this thing sort of, as a sort of naive. But Nick said it. Nick wrote it. I mean, clearly, you know, the adolescent who emerges from those experiences, you know, has shows all the symptoms of people who've been through traumatic experience. And I've seen traumatic experience in other. I mean, I have war reporter friends from my 2-3 years of doing that who are acknowledged PTSD sufferers, and it's interesting. Some of them went to boarding school as well, of course, because boarding school people tend, particularly the men, tend to be adrenaline thrill seekers as well. And war reporting, kind of pictures that. So, I mean, I don't want to leave the women out of here, because I have to say, a good 20% of my correspondents are women, and while they present in quite different ways, that is extremely significant, and their suffering, it is, in many ways they suffer quite similarly, particularly in the stiff upper lip realm. But the standard things which we will all know of sort of carrying those fight or flight behaviors on into the rest of your life, seeking sort of experiences that sort of challenge your lack of dangerous experiences that challenge your lack of self-understanding or self-belief, or and so on, the misuse of substances, of alcohol, sexual experimentation, sort of manic sexual experimentation, all those things, fantastically common, I'd say, particularly in the men. I think less so in the women. You can kind of draw from the experiences, from the tales I've been told, a sort of a life pattern which starts with a sort of chaotic, but often potentially highly high achieving early adulthood, possibly with elements which now, in the new understanding of bipolarity, would be seen as including that, and but inevitably crashes of some sort or another, often, which are most usually depression of some sort or another. So, and the crashes often come with a relationship breakdown, or many people there having children, their own children reaching the same age as they were when the ACEs began, and then, of course, this is sort of a sort of standard depression pattern, which including all the self-medication issues and anger issues and so on, and often exacerbated by failures to make relationships work. And then most people now, I think, gosh, I weep for the previous generations who went through this without any help at all. Most people at some point, either forced into it by life circumstances, whatever, will arrive at some sort of therapeutic solution. And then again, you start to see things that can work and things that clearly don't. I think the most obvious thing from the correspondence with people that I have is how many people were let down by some therapeutic techniques, like the sort of off-the-shelf CBT techniques, which have done, which are techniques which teach you to handle ordinary life problems, but don't address, it seems to me, the underlying traumas which actually explain the problems, and that leaves people with a fear or a disgust for that kind of, for talking therapy, and a higher level of self-hate, perhaps, because they begin to see themselves as uncurable. And then the other thing which which worries me a lot, because I played a part in it, and I now have to question that, is revenge seeking. Revenge therapy, if you like. So a lot of my work has been helping enable people to try and piece together what actually happened, and that's by helping them, by putting them in touch with other people who've complained about the same institution, and I'm sure some of those would say that's been helpful. I hope most of them would, but I know that, and I think from the beginning I've always said I do think you should seek therapy, some kind of wording first, but And I've always said that you are very unlikely to get satisfaction if you start going back to the institution seeking apologies. And indeed, if you go to the police seeking investigations, it can happen.
Yeah.
You read about it in the papers. It happened at my school, but it's very, very rare. And too often you reawaken your traumas or have new ones because of the frustrations you will have dealing with the system and dealing, see, once again, with lies and prevarication that stop you and the child in you getting the justice that you wanted when you were 8 and that you still deserve now. So, yeah, and there's, and as we were, going back to this psychological piece we mentioned earlier, that there is no retribution, there is no resolution often from the adults for the psychological abuse you suffered. The stories of people going to elderly parents and going, you really need to apologize to me. They don't usually end well, I'm afraid.
Oh, I've put my hand. I tried that one. I tried. My father had already died. My last words to my father, I was on his deathbed. I said he was boarding Radley College, military, and I said to him, I felt like you've hated me my whole life. Yeah. And I was like 24, 25, and he burst into tears and he said, my whole life's been a lie, Piers.
Oh, Piers, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. And I think for me, my healing journey through my own therapeutic work, I have a really lovely connection with my father now.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that when he was alive.
Yes.
I tried it with my mother, and we ended up having a screaming match.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that really worked, but she was more respectful because I'd never screamed at her before. That was
my father's dead. I have a much better relationship with my mother now. But I think she would, I would like her to watch this. I don't think she would, but she didn't like the book. And
my mother won't read the book. I've written
it took the jailing of the first teacher from my school. He had to be banged up for 11 years. Martin Haig, our science teacher, for my mother to say things that actually got through to me. We had to go that far. Not me writing a book or going on telly. It was the law had to say. So, yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, our ancestors, the parents who sent us, the teachers, the adults who abused. I mean, all you can do is try and find the empathy and the love for them. I mean, I've as you know, in the book and on TV, I've interviewed men who were serial sex offenders in boarding schools, and I've yet to find one I wasn't completely convinced was a victim. And I think it's a terribly, I don't. I mean, there's some men I will never forgive, but they were the ones further up the machine, the cover up, the people who covered up.
Yeah.
The good men who weren't sexual abusers, but they could have stopped them.
Yeah.
But so I mean, we all know this is, getting through this is about finding love for yourself and love for others, and the continuing the hate is just, and the anger is never going to help, is it?
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
But it's such it's a trite thing to say because it's so unhelpful to many people. But
yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I think that's really helpful for people to hear about this thing about revenge seeking or wanting people to say sorry.
Yeah.
Because it's about ourselves. We have to almost forgive ourselves and. So thank you. That's really useful.
No, I think it is important, and I think it's a lot when you're going. If you're going to go on being angry at an institution that does not have the means to make it up to you. 50 years later, it is you ploughing a useless furrow. It's really important to acknowledge that. I mean, those schools' insurers will not let them apologize.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to some kind of open-minded people at the Boarding Schools Association. Now, it's perfectly clear where the legality of it is. So railing, so we mirror the injustice, the appalling injustices of how we were treated 30, 40, 50 years ago with the way those institutions are behaving now. And it is pointless.
I mean, so the question then really is, and I'm kind of skipping forward a little bit, but what can we do to change the system if they cannot say anything because of insurance? And how do we change the system? Because a lot of the questions I've had from the people on the boarding school forum was, well, what's the future? How can we stop this?
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, and if any, and often people do get in touch with me saying, do you think I should go to the police? And I, and I try to give in an unpatronizing way that express the caveats that we've just talked about. But I also say, if you think the abuser is still at large, then that might be a reason for going to them. And also, if you think you're doing that can make children safer today, then that might also be a reason for doing it, and that might help you feel something good, because you're the extremely scary act of going public and disclosing in that way. If there's some palpable good that can come out of it, then yes. So I mean, one of the, so I believe in any campaigning to change institutional behavior, it needs to be multi-pronged. So, and I've talked about this with some of the people before. So I think it's a hearts and minds things with parents who still see buying a boarding school place for their child as equivalent to buying a new Tesla or putting in a heated swimming pool, to get them to understand. And it's about making the safeguarding regime in institutions that deal with children, whether boarding or not, better, or at least up to the standards of the rest of Europe, which it isn't. And it's about and removing and campaigning to remove the tax advantages boarding schools have. Why are they charities? I live in Scotland, where we are in the process of getting rid of the charitable status of boarding schools, which is great. And so it's a multi-level thing, but I have to say it's not going well or fast. I mean, boarding numbers are massively down because of COVID. My school closed, my prep school closed at last, not because of the multiple allegations of criminal behaviour there, but because of, well, at least they said this, because of the fall off in pupils because of COVID. Right. It's sort of extraordinary that should be the case. That parent, with all the publicity about Ashdown House, that parents should still send their children off, but the virus stops that. But so I'm rambling a bit, Piers. Sorry, concentrate me. So three-pronged approaches, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when in the dust of Britain emerging from Brexit and COVID, you'll see boarding school numbers down massively. But that's partly because 30% are now coming from abroad. And for many European kids aren't going to come to school in Britain any longer. The Chinese and the Russians, who are the bulk of them, may still do so. But how long can you sell a British education as the best way forward for a child? I mean, look at the people who are leading the country at the moment. I see it dying. The British middle class can't afford it anymore. When I went to Eton, it was within reach for a GP or a wealthy country farmer or an accountant. But those fees in real terms are 3 times as high. So it's up to 40,000 a year.
Right.
So the support base in terms of the customers who can afford it's got to go down.
Okay.
And slowly legal things are happening. I think, when there's a non-Tory government eventually in power, I think the principle of removing charitable status from schools will go, from all private schools will go. That's part of the
Thank you. I think I think it sounds like over the coming years this is going to diminish boarding school education. I'm hearing that because of Brexit, because of COVID, because of the fees. So it sounds like and I guess because of that, maybe the numbers dropping off, because the prep boarding schools were always smaller numbers anyhow. Surely it's not going to be sustainable for a lot of them to stay open.
No, when I wrote the book, I interviewed the headmasters of some the sort of 100, 120 pupil little prep boarding schools, and they said things like, it's basically we get over the line from red into black with the last 3 beds.
Really?
And it's very clear also that prep boarding schools survive because they have children to board. So children are pressurized into boarding when they could commute, because that's how like a restaurant making its money on the wine. That's how you make your money, because the fees kind of double, and actually you can feed a lot of children quite cheaply, and if you don't look after them very well, even more cheaply. But so there's and there's a real change in. I get quite a lot of mail from people going, my husband wants to send the children. I have to say, I had no idea when we got married that this was even in his mind. How do I stop him? Quite a bit of that. So I think there's a cultural change going on. But I think also it's important for us who are educated, articulate people with the ability to have some influence in the public sphere, to be very aware that the problems that affected us at childcare institutions, which is what we were in, are still affecting tens of thousands of British children, and more children in care than ever before, and that in a country that's failing economically, conditions can only get worse for them, and that childcare systems, as people like Tom Perry of Mandate Now, a boarding school survivor who has worked really powerfully to try and change law, point out our childcare systems are protection systems just are not adequate and not adequately supervised. So it's important for us from the private sector of bad childcare to reach out and keep an eye on people in the public side of it. That's because the only thing we can really take from our experiences is let's make sure it doesn't. No, not the only thing, but an important thing is let's make sure it doesn't happen to other children.
Yeah. I love what you said earlier about the happiness thing as well. I feel that I was sharing earlier about this this model I'm kind of putting together in my mind about the 3 stages of healing from boarding school, and I feel like the 3rd stage, I kind of call it integration, which is about almost the happiness. It's like I went through a stage of denial at the beginning, total denial about school. I was good, worked in the city, and then I went into total hatred for it, anger, and that kind of weighed on me a very unpleasant number of years. And that the 3rd level for me has been like learning to find the good in it, and that the happiness with that.
Yeah.
What would you feel around that on your own healing journey and what you see with others? You mentioned about forgiveness, and
I'm not, I'm not there. I'm afraid I'm not there yet, Piers. I'm still an angry boarding school survivor.
Okay.
I'm incredibly loved and looked after, and I'm quite good at monitoring myself, at looking after myself. About watching for manic episodes, watching my anger, and I have means and techniques to do that. I'm very lucky, but I haven't got to the. I mean, I'm writing a book. My current project is about slavery, the British and slavery, and using my own family's. My own family, I found out, were slavers in Jamaica and Tobago, and it's kind of uncomfortable side of me realizes that I'm this project, which I've been to Jamaica and Tobago. I know why I need to do. There's a good reason for acknowledging what we did and stop trying to cover it up. But it's still driven by my ego and my anger. So. I think I think for boarding school survivors, we need to seek the happiness, but believing that resolution is possible, it may be a bit of a distraction. It may be better to look for ways to manage ourselves and help those around us who care and look after us to cope as well. More self-knowledge, more honesty, to find it, the best stability that we can. It's painful to. I've friends, people I've met through this work, and people who I knew at school who their search for, I suppose it's kind of to return to a preschool self. To that kind of, I admire their bravery in looking for it, but I worry that it's not possible. There are really interesting techniques we said we might mention this, like EMDR and use of psychedelics, and I know people who have gone through that.
I've tried.
Have you really? Oh, right. What was your experience?
Well, I have to say, I've tried.
Maybe that's not. Don't let me push you. Maybe it's not.
I think I have tried most things on the healing journey, and I spent 3 years. My own journey was Buddhist monastery, and while I was there, it wasn't far from yourself, and I went up once a week to see a Jungian analyst who was in Edinburgh, who was kind of worked with a lot of ex-boarders. That was in 2000. After that, I did some shamanic work, so 5 years as training as a shaman, and that involved plant medicine. So I've tried, and I think you've got to be very careful with things.
Got to be very careful. I mean, I know. I think EMDR. I'm going to assume most people will know what that is, which is tapping therapy, which is light therapy, which is not quite mainstream. I mean, just anecdotally, from this huge, correspondence base I have, quite a lot of people who believe that's been very helpful. People, and clearly in PTSD, which I'm sure is the right lens to look at a lot of these experiences from a clinical side. I mean, there are other treatments and other approaches, and you look at those. EMDR there's certainly something there. So we're sort of talking about subcognitive methods of approaching trauma and ancient trauma and memories. And I know a couple of people who have been lucky enough to be treated. These people with severe bipolarity, which of course is not uncommon in this field, who have been treated under serious conditions with psychedelics, and again have had results. And that apparently is being used to treat PTSD among veterans in the States. Well, there's research going on into it. So but part of our healing is keeping an open mind, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things. I don't know if you've noticed that at the beginning, I was very shut down to trying anything.
Yes.
And the more gone on, the more I've gone,
Yes.
oh, let's have a go at that. I wonder if that works.
No, totally. No, and I'm very much the same frame of mind. No, I mean, it's there are people who I know lots of people who won't go and talk to a head shrinker. I mean, it doesn't bloody work. And they may have had a bad experience with CBT. I mean, that may well be the reason, but there are people for whom that shell of self-protection, of self-belief is so vulnerable that the most basic report, like going to your GP and talking about SSRIs, what you and I know are really, basic things that may have a help.
Just what's SSRIs for the listeners?
Sorry, so the Prozac kind of drugs,
okay. Yeah.
the mild antidepressants. So, there's a blocked wall about anything other than reaching for the whiskey bottle. But I should say, from my own experience, I started seeking professional help when I was about 30. I mean, and I also, I was also lucky in that I was always very open to those around me about what had happened, what I'd been through at boarding school. So I'm perhaps less empathetic than I should be to some people who are determined to keep the shell up, the shield up, the armor up.
Is there anything else? You've mentioned EMDR, psychedelics. You've talked about kind of any other things in the correspondence you've had with people, and they've gone, that's really worked, or that's been great.
I mean, a large number of people, particularly the older people, and I heard from people in their 90s, who have found use of some kind of meditative technique. It's their way, and they may never have used pharmaceutical interventions at all. I think all of us, in the sort of campaigning groups and around boarding schools, and with some knowledge of the psychotherapeutic library of techniques, we would say that the first thing you have to say to anyone who presents to you with these stories, this history, is you've got to talk. I mean, talking therapy is the beginning of everything, and it may be all you need. And I think we were all hugely relieved when Nick Duffel and Joy Cheverian actually sort of clinicalized the term boarding school syndrome. And when I think the first time I went to a conference at Brighton University of 4 practitioners in boarding school therapy a couple of years ago, and I just thought, this is bliss, what a wonderful thing. To 400 years of these insane institutions, at last we've got professionals paying £70 a day or whatever to get better at treating people with this problem. It's wonderful. Organised by Thurston Bassett and other people from Brighton. So things are getting better. But there's 1 million people, I calculated, in Britain who alive today who went through boarding school.
1 million people, really?
Huge. Yeah.
That's amazing.
I put it in. I'm not great at maths, but I lay out the figures in the book, actually, and I was going, but actually it makes sense. I mean, given how long we all live. So, and if 30% of those had some kind of adverse experience, hey, I mean, young psychotherapists in training should be looking at it as a way forward. And as we said again, let's not forget the 80,000 children in care at the moment. More children in institutional care in England than are in boarding school.
Really? How many? What's the number now?
So that can mean
for
anything from approved school to foster homes.
Right. Wow.
There are 80,000 at the moment, I think. I mean, I ought to check it. And it's got, and we're at the highest number of children in care in Britain ever, partly because of the strains of the last year.
So just want to check on time. How are you for time wise?
Great. I mean, I could do, have we got to the end? I mean, I could do a few more minutes. Or
Yeah, I've still got another.
I'm emotionally exhausted, Piers.
Do you want to have a breather?
No, I'm fine. Let's go. If you're all right.
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
Great. You're great. You're a good interviewer. It's lovely not to be rushed.
I have to say, I get quite nervous. I was always the shy person at school. I wouldn't talk, and therefore this last year I was thinking, oh, I'd love to speak to people, but I'm terrified of speaking. I was like a scout leader, and having to stand at the front and speak, I'm like, oh, can someone else do this, please? But I'm learning.
I like it, actually. There's something in my ego that yeah, I like it. But then there'll be sort of a sort of moment of self-disgust afterwards when I talk too much, it's blaring away.
I get my wife to look over them afterwards, and she says, "Well, Piers, look at them more." So I've got, someone to keep me grounded.
You look really well. I mean, no, but you're there's a comforting, therapeutic self to you, which makes it very easy.
Thank you. So yeah, I've got a few more questions. So one of them, what have I got here? One is one of my questions was about initiation, but
you said I mean, it's not. I mean, my wife's did a master's in child anthropology. She should answer it. But I don't know. I mean, my post boarding school self is just, almost against anything organized for children without their consent. And it's so easy to get consent from children, and it's not real consent. I mean, children consented to going to boarding school, and their parents went to go. He really wanted to go, but that's not consent. Children try to please those who they love. So yeah, I mean, I've got two healthy young people, my children in this house. Well, one's away doing an internship, but they kind of, both of them seem to have organised their own initiations. My 16-year-old daughter plays football for a club in North Edinburgh, captain of her team, and it's brilliantly mixed class-wise. And yeah, I mean, she seems to have done it for herself. She's a big campaigner on gender issues. That's bonding. She gets into trouble with the authorities at her school when she tells the headmistress off for calling people she when they identify as them, they, and that's great. My son, who went to a famous private school, but as a day pupil here in Edinburgh, similarly, a lot of alcohol's involved, but I mean, they're both fantastically healthier, I think, I hope, mentally healthier people than me and many who emerged. It's interesting. I mean, when I read the book, I mean, we all know about the Maasai, and I spent some time. I've worked as a journalist in East Africa and done a bit around. I did something around circumcision ceremonies, actually, among tribes in the Rift Valley at the time of when circumcision was becoming to be seen as a barrier against AIDS. And of course, a lot of that was combating cultural stuff around initiation, where what defines you is whether you had a foreskin or not. In some of it, so persuading foreskinned ethnic groups to remove them to protect against HIV was a huge thing. But and those are all around teenage initiation ceremonies as well. But I don't know. I'm blethering. I don't think I really have an opinion. I just think children. I grew up in a world where we weren't trusted as children, and what I found in raising my children is partly I've been there. My parents weren't, and I trust them, and their views, and listen to them.
You've frozen, Alex. What do I think about initiation? So,
initiation. Yeah, not ceremonies. I mean, initiation.
Rites of passage. So,
rites of passage. Yeah.
I'm very intrigued by them. I've kind of really, because of the Jungian work I did in my 20s.
Yeah.
I've been spending the last couple of years reading a lot of Robert Moore's work about initiation, and I'm part of the Mankind Project, which does rites of passage. I also help with scouts of 15 to 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
And therefore, as I was writing my book, I just wrote it as a journal of what happened to me.
Yeah.
And then I got someone to read it, and they were like, "No, you need to put more in." And it's come to me about initiation, and it was partly triggered reading your book. I'm like, this idea that initiation, Robert Bly talks about it in his book, Iron John. Which, as you can see, another one.
Classic. Yeah, absolutely.
And he says there's two stages. One is there's a break from the parents.
Yeah.
And that's the first stage. And the other one is that the older men or older women take the boy or the girl off. Now, what I see in boarding school is that we have that first stage. We have the break with the parents.
Yeah.
But the second stage is, instead of it being older men and women, it's boys and girls who are initiating us. So all we have, now is we have boys and girls in men's and women's bodies. So we're not initiated people.
No. No, and you couple that with people who've been prematurely sexualized because of the atmosphere in the school, and you've got a recipe for all sorts of horrors. No, totally. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, my wife is very interesting on how social media, which we all decry, and is the biggest curse of the age, but how actually among the adolescents who she sees whose development is playing out well, that actually the healthy use of social media, particularly this year, in the time of adolescents being separated from each other, it can work very effectively. It can be great, and she'll come up with examples of it. And so clearly the powerful new forces of communication around which would enable ways of initiation. My default position usually for people my age, and you're younger than me, you look much younger than me, but is that when we complain about new technology, we probably got it wrong, because our parents did. So, and I don't have much trust for our parents' generation at all. So just as with video gaming as well, it's not all wrong. But so I think, again, you have to keep minds open for that. I've just interviewed. I mean, in my more normal life, I do some interviews for the Times newspaper, and I've just interviewed a young man who won Great British Bake Off.
Okay.
I don't know if you watched that, but and he's really interesting. He's 20 years old and comes from lived all his life in one community where he went to school on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Strong church-going family. Member, not a scout, but the Boys Brigade, which is the church version of it. And if you watch the show, everyone went, this is the nicest man any of us had ever seen on the television. And you come away going, this is a very sorted young man, because he's a student. So he's a student in the city, but he lives partly with his parents, partly in a flat, and he seems a happy, comfortable person with really strong bonds of community and belief and values around him. Now, I'm not a Christian. That's another effect of boarding school.
Yeah,
but it was really, it was interesting to see. Likeable to a person. So, whatever gets you there, isn't it? I mean, when I was in Jamaica, I went to see, researching the slavery book, I was interested in seeing organizations working with disadvantaged youth that my family might start to think of supporting, as part of acknowledging our roots, that our privilege, if not our wealth, was rooted in slavery. And the best one I saw is an organization which is in London as well, called Fight for Peace, which is so they're in Kingston, Jamaica, and they're in South London, and so on. And that's about getting trained counselors into gyms to help people do jiu-jitsu and kickboxing, and so young people, and then talk and learn to interact with each other. And there's elements of course of initiation around training and those sort of things. And you just thought, that's really clever, good work. So horses for courses, isn't it? But you're right. I mean, I think boarding school in many ways exploited a lot of the sort of natural social instincts and perverted them. So the instinct of adolescence to club together and protect each other and look after each other and form groupings, which is clearly primeval, is then perverted into forming this sort of inward-looking, secret-keeping class that then goes through life helping each other out and pushing outsiders away and down. It's a wholly unnatural environment. And anyone who says, hold on, boarding schools like the Maasai taking the children off into the forest for 6 weeks is talking out of their arse, because it's not like that at all. It's 6-year-olds, it's pre-adolescence. And it's 5 years, So
thank you.
I don't know.
No, that's really interesting.
Interesting.
I could talk for ages about all of that. There's a great organization in America called Boys to Men. Similar works. I think it's kind of come out of the Mankind Project. Does similar work, that they circle up with men and boys, and they might not have fathers, young boys, and they just have a mentor, someone they can speak to. And that's starting to spread across America, and it's in the UK as well. It's called Journeyman, which is a great organization.
I looked that up. That's really interesting. I mean, years ago, when I worked for a newspaper in London, we were linked up with a school that, quite simply, in a London school, quite simply put young men like us, reporters, to get together once a week to read with boys, one-on-one. And we took, we'd read Tintin or comics or superhero books or whatever. It was just so they could be with a man who liked reading, and would do it with them. And that was effective.
I think it's so important Robert Bly talks about it, Robert Moore talks about it, that, the ancient tribal traditions knew that the boys needed to have the guidance of the older men. The girls, seemed to do better, but the tribal traditions knew that the boys needed the men. But for me, in boarding school, you had one housemaster or a tutor on duty for 50 boys. So who took care of us? It was the boys. So.
And also, it's more than half your life as well. And there's no element of choice either. Whereas you'd hope in a healthy community you would choose who you went to for mentorship. It'd be obvious. Let children being allowed to make choices seems to me so key to it.
Yes. So I'm kind of aware we've gone over quite a bit. I've got other questions, but they're going to have to wait till maybe another time. But I really so appreciate the work you're doing, the support you have with the database, and the articles, and your book is excellent. So thank you so much for all the time you put into it. I mean, my book, I'm going, oh my God, I've got so much work to do.
You just got to sit down and plow it out. That's the only way with books. You just, thanks so much, Piers. That was a real pleasure. It was great to talk. I'm really interested in some of the places you're coming from. They're different from my experience. My experience is the psychotherapy as an observer is very clinical. I mean, it's very orthodox, and I'm well aware that there's perhaps a gap in my thinking about how we achieve happiness, as we were saying.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, anytime you want to have a conversation, or if you're in West Yorkshire, please feel free to.
Similarly, if you're in Edinburgh, it'd be great to meet you.
Thank you. So yes, for final bit, if people, I'll put a link to Alex's book into the description. You say you've got a new book out about
in May. Called Blood Legacy.
Blood Legacy.
Really sort of fighty title. Yeah, it's out in May. I hope. A bit nervous about that one. But yeah, I've actually got quite a lot of copies of that. But if anyone wants to email me, I'll sign it and send you a copy back, and you won't have to give money to Amazon.
Okay, great. If we go to stifferupperlip.com,
yeah, there's a contact. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, do that. There's a contact slot on there which I monitor, because I do, as I said, get quite a lot of email, quite a lot of mail through that.
Okay.
Stifferupperlipbook.com.
Stifferupperlipbook.com. I'll put it into the description box at the bottom.
Right. And I mean, you might want to link. I don't know if you saw the ITV documentary. I mean, it is sort of kind of how mainstream telly approaches that. I mean, it is entirely largely about sexual abuse. I mean, so that's kind of the problem with it. But that's available on YouTube.
Okay, I'll put that in the description box as well. So
no, sure.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Alex, and
all right.
A great day. And
you.
Yeah. Okay.
I hope you don't get flooded out.
No, we won't.
Why you as well. I used to do that when I lived in Thailand.
Thank you. Okay. Take care.
See you. Bye.